Hey guys, tonight we step quietly onto a Roman street just before dawn, when the stone beneath your feet still holds the night's cool, and the city feels like it's holding its breath. You're standing there in secondhand sandals, listening to the soft creak of shutters opening above you, the distant splash of water as someone dumps a chamber pot, and the gentle murmur of a city that never quite sleeps. Somewhere nearby, a magistrate is clearing his throat, a small crowd is forming, and you have the strange feeling that whatever lesson Rome plans to teach today, you probably won't survive it with your dignity intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, feel free to tell me where you're listening from and what time it is on your end of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't need to look hard to see how deeply punishment is woven into Roman daily life. It's not hidden away behind prison walls like it is for you today. Instead, it lives right here in the open, mingling with bread sellers and arguing politicians. A crooked wooden platform stands at the edge of the square, scarred and smoothed by years of use, and you can tell it's been used for more than speeches. This is a place where justice isn't whispered, it's performed. One mainstream historical fact that quietly hums beneath everything you see is this: ancient Rome didn't rely much on long-term imprisonment as punishment. Prisons existed, yes, but mostly as holding cells, not places for rehabilitation or reflection. Punishment was meant to be swift, visible, and memorable. Rome wanted you to see it, to feel it in your bones, and ideally to learn from someone else's mistake without having to make the same one yourself. Think of it as civic education, but with a much worse curriculum. As you shuffle closer with the crowd, you notice how mixed it is. There are citizens in clean tunics, slaves with eyes trained on the ground, freedmen pretending not to care, and children perched on curbs like it's street entertainment. Punishment here is communal. You're not just an observer. By being present, you're part of the system. Rome expects you to absorb the message, nod wisely, and maybe walk home a little straighter than before. Of course, historians still argue whether this visibility truly improved public order or simply normalized cruelty. Some scholars suggest it reinforced social hierarchies more than moral behavior, reminding everyone exactly where they stood in the pecking order. Others think it genuinely worked as deterrence, because once you've watched a punishment unfold with all your senses awake, it's hard to forget. As you stand there now, trying not to make eye contact with anyone important, you can feel both arguments pulling at you. The sensory details are impossible to ignore. You smell sweat and dust, sharp oil from nearby lamps, and something vaguely metallic that you don't want to think too hard about. A minor official reads charges from a tablet, his voice droning like an early morning podcast you didn't quite sign up for. The accused stands nearby, and even without hearing the details, you can guess the verdict has already been decided. Roman justice, efficient as it is, isn't exactly known for suspense. Here's a quirky tidbit most people don't expect. In some cases, punishment days were scheduled to coincide with market days. That wasn't an accident. More people around meant a bigger audience, which meant a lesson more thoroughly taught. Imagine planning your grocery run around a public sentencing, thinking bread, olives, and oh yes, watch a flogging before lunch. Rome had a talent for multitasking, even when it came to moral instruction. You start to understand that punishment in Rome isn't just about pain, it's about shame, symbolism, and social control. The body is important, but reputation is often even more valuable. Losing face in front of your neighbors can sting longer than any physical blow. That's why so many Roman punishments focused on exposure, tying you up where people knew your name, your family, your past. It's accountability, Roman style, and it's deeply uncomfortable in a way that feels oddly familiar even now. Every so often, the crowd murmurs, not out of sympathy, but curiosity. Someone cracks a quiet joke, because apparently gallows humor didn't start in the Middle Ages. You catch yourself thinking that if Rome had comment sections, they would be brutal. And yet, amid all this, there's a strange calm to it. The process is ritualized, expected, almost boring to those who've seen it too many times. That banality is part of what makes it unsettling and oddly soothing once you stop resisting it. Rome's legal mindset believed punishment maintained cosmic and social balance. Wrongdoing disrupted order and punishment restored it, like resetting a scale that had tipped too far in one direction. Whether that belief genuinely comforted people or simply justified harsh measures is another thing historians still argue about. Standing here, half awake, you might find both explanations oddly plausible. As the event winds down, the crowd begins to disperse just as quietly as it gathered. Someone complains about the weather. Someone else wonders if they'll still get the freshest bread. Life resumes not because justice was served in some abstract way, but because Rome has checked a box on its daily to-do list. And you, lucky you, get to walk away with all your limbs and most of your pride intact. You drift off down a narrow street, sandals slapping softly against stone, carrying with you the unspoken lesson Rome wanted you to learn. This is a city where punishment is woven into the fabric of ordinary mornings, where law and spectacle blur together, and where the fear of standing on that platform keeps the wheels of empire turning. As your breathing slows, that image lingers, not sharply, but like a fading echo, setting the tone for everything that follows. You keep moving through the city as the morning stretches out, your pace unhurried now, the way it gets when no one is actively pointing at you and passing judgment. The sun lifts itself above the tiled rooftops, warming the stone and coaxing the noise of Rome into full bloom. Carts creak, vendors argue, dogs bark, and over it all floats the steady awareness that law here is not an abstract idea. It's something you see, hear, and occasionally need to step around. Rome law is famously complex, and one mainstream historical fact worth letting settle into your mind is this. By the late Republic and early Empire, Rome had developed an elaborate legal system with written laws, courts, magistrates, and clear distinctions between social classes. But for all that sophistication, enforcement leaned heavily on public punishment. Justice wasn't meant to happen quietly in back rooms. It was theater, and you are always in the audience. You wander past the Forum, that wide-open stage where politics, religion, and law collide into one constant performance. This is where speeches echo off marble, where accusations fly like badly aimed birds, and where verdicts are often delivered to a crowd already buzzing with opinion. When punishment happens here, it's not just about the person being sentenced. It's about reminding everyone watching who holds power and why. Historians still argue whether Roman punishments were intentionally theatrical from the beginning, or whether spectacle emerged naturally as crowds gathered and traditions solidified. Some think magistrates leaned into showmanship, fully aware that a dramatic sentence reinforced their authority. Others suggest it was the public's appetite for spectacle that shaped the system, officials simply giving the people what they expected. Standing here, with the murmur of voices washing over you like low surf, it's easy to believe both sides. You notice how order is maintained not just by fear, but by routine. Punishment slots neatly into the day, sandwiched between court proceedings and commercial errands. It's oddly efficient. There's a rhythm to it, almost calming, like knowing your favorite radio show always comes on at the same time. Only here, the content is a bit more sobering, and the hosts wear togas. A particularly quirky tidbit floats up from the legal weeds. Many Roman magistrates served for short terms, sometimes just a year, and establishing a reputation for firmness or severity could help their political ambitions. That meant punishments sometimes doubled as campaign ads. You can practically hear the unspoken slogan, "I kept Rome in line." It's the ancient version of tough-on-crime branding minus the press releases. As you pause near a shaded portico, you see a small cluster forming again. Nothing dramatic yet, Just officials arranging themselves, writing tablets being consulted, faces tightening into official seriousness. The very predictability of it all is what makes it effective. There's no grand announcement. People simply know. This is where it happens, this is how it goes. You feel your shoulders relax, even as your curiosity keeps you rooted in place. Roman punishments thrived on visibility. Stocks, whippings, humiliations, even executions were positioned for maximum viewership. Roads leading into cities often hosted the harshest penalties, a literal warning at the gates. It's uncomfortable to admit, but there's a logic to it. If the goal is deterrence, you want the message seen by travelers, merchants, soldiers, anyone arriving with fresh eyes and potentially fresh mischief. This blend of law and spectacle also created a strange emotional distance. When something becomes routine, you stop reacting to it with the same intensity. The crowd's reaction to punishment often feels oddly flat, not cruel, not kind, just observant. You realize Rome has trained its people to see discipline as part of the scenery. Like fountains or temples, it's simply there. Historians still argue whether this emotional dulling helped stabilize the empire or eroded empathy in dangerous ways. Did it make citizens more obedient or just more detached? You imagine living here long enough that these scenes barely register, and that thought feels more unsettling than the punishments themselves. It's one thing to fear pain, it's another to accept it as background noise. There's also a clear hierarchy on display. Citizens, non-citizens, slaves. Each category experiences law differently, and punishment underscores those distinctions with brutal clarity. You notice how the crowd instinctively knows who deserves sympathy and who doesn't, based largely on status. It's an unspoken rule book everyone carries in their head, and you can't help thinking how much easier that must have made enforcement. As you drift away, there's a moment of dark humor that slips in, almost without permission. The whole setup has the efficiency of a badly run stage play where everyone knows their cue, but no one questions the script. And yet, it works. Rome didn't rule its vast territories through kindness alone. It ruled by making consequences visible, repeatable, and deeply boring in their consistency. One last glance back at the forum shows officials dispersing, critics resuming their arguments, and merchants reclaiming their space. Justice here doesn't linger. It does its job and moves on, leaving the city to absorb the lesson at its own pace. You take a breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on your back, and continue walking, already aware that this seamless blend of law and spectacle is only the beginning of stranger, more unsettling methods yet to come. You find yourself wandering into a narrower street now, where the noise softens and the walls lean in just a little closer. Here, justice feels less like public theater and more like routine maintenance. This is where the ordinary punishments happen, the ones so common they barely earn a raised eyebrow. Flogging, beating, correction by force. Not glamorous, not ceremonial, just part of keeping Rome running on time. A mainstream historical fact settles in as you walk. Corporal punishment was widely used in ancient Rome, especially for slaves, soldiers, and the lower classes. Whips, rods, and staffs were tools of discipline, accepted and expected. Roman thinkers openly believed that physical pain produced discipline and discipline produced order. It's a tidy theory, very Roman in its logic, even if your modern instincts quietly flinch. You pass a modest courtyard where a small group has gathered, not out of excitement but habit. A man stands with his hands bound, his posture already braced for impact. There's no speech this time, no grand announcement. The punishment is the message. You notice how efficiently it's done, like an errand someone wants to finish before lunch. That efficiency makes it worse, in a calm, creeping way. Historians still argue whether frequent beatings actually improved behavior or merely reinforced a culture of fear. Some suggest it created immediate compliance but long-term resentment, especially among enslaved people and soldiers. Others point out that Rome's military and economic success implies the system, harsh as it was, achieved its goals. Standing quietly at the edge, you suspect both conclusions can be true at once. The sensory details press in gently but insistently. You hear the dull rhythm of blows. Not cinematic, not dramatic, just a steady, unpleasant sound. The crowd barely reacts. A woman adjusts her shawl. A child tugs on a sleeve. It's all painfully ordinary. You feel your breathing slow anyway, because repetition has a sedating quality, even when the subject is grim. A lesser-known tidbit drifts into view. Roman soldiers were sometimes beaten by their officers using the vine staff, a symbol of authority as much as a tool of pain. The staff itself mattered. It wasn't random violence, it was coded, almost ceremonial. Being struck by it wasn't just punishment, it was a reminder of who you were and where you fell on the chain of command. Today it might feel excessive, but to a Roman soldier, it was simply Tuesday. Class looms over everything. A citizen might face a beating under certain circumstances, but it was more likely for those without full rights. Slaves could be beaten at an owner's discretion, with few legal repercussions. It's easy to feel the imbalance here, how punishment reinforces social order by targeting bodies deemed expendable. You shift your weight, grateful again for your imaginary visitor status. Historians still argue whether Roman citizens truly viewed these punishments as just or merely necessary. Legal texts suggest a moral framework that justified pain as corrective, even virtuous. But graffiti, letters, and satire hint at private discomfort and criticism. Rome, like any society, wasn't a single unified mind. As you stand here, you can almost hear those conflicting thoughts murmuring under the city's surface. What strikes you most is how normalized it all seems. There's no sense of outrage, no dramatic buildup. Punishment blends into daily life the way traffic noise does for you now. You realize this normalization is part of its power. When fear is constant but mild, it becomes less about terror and more about habit. You behave because that's how things are. It's an unsettlingly effective system. A moment of quiet humor slips in as you imagine a Roman pamphlet titled, "Everything Hurts, and That's the Point." It almost works. The empire thrives on pain carefully distributed, like seasoning. Too much would revolt the population, too little would invite chaos. Rome aims for a steady simmer, not a rolling boil. As the beating ends, there's no applause, no ceremony. The crowd thins without comment. Someone nearby grumbles about being late to work. The punished man is untied, allowed to leave, leaning heavily on his legs, but alive, which by Roman standards counts as a mercy. You watch him disappear down the street and wonder how often he's done this walk before. Historians still argue whether such everyday cruelty desensitized Romans to larger acts of violence. Did watching routine beatings make it easier to accept executions and mass punishments later on? Or were these categories mentally separate, each with their own rules? You don't have an answer, and Rome never really provided one. It simply kept moving. You drift along again, the echo of dull impacts fading into the larger hum of the city. Flogging here isn't a headline event. It's background noise, a maintenance procedure. And as your steps carry you onward, you feel the slow realization settling in. The most unsettling punishments aren't always the spectacular ones. Sometimes it's the ordinary, repeatable acts of pain that shape a society most deeply. You continue on, drifting toward a small open square where the air feels different, lighter somehow, even though nothing here is particularly pleasant. In the center stands a familiar wooden structure, rough-hewn and sun-bleached, a little crooked from years of use. Stocks. They don't move, they don't chase, they don't shout, they just wait. And somehow that makes them more unsettling than anything loud or violent you've seen so far. One mainstream historical fact eases into your thoughts. Public shaming was a formal and widely accepted punishment in ancient Rome. Stocks, pillories, and other restraints were used not primarily to injure the body, but to expose it. The goal wasn't pain, at least not the main goal, but humiliation. To be seen, recognized, and judged by your neighbors was supposed to be corrective enough on its own. You slow your steps as you approach. Someone is already locked in place, hands and neck held fast, posture awkward and helpless. The punishment is measured in hours, not blows, and time, as you know, can be far more creative than any weapon. The crowd here feels different too. There's curiosity mixed with casual disdain, like people watching a street performer they don't quite approve of.
Historians still argue whether Roman society viewed shame as more powerful than physical pain. Some scholars suggest reputation was the cornerstone of Roman identity, so damaging it struck at the very heart of a person's social existence. Others point out that for those already low on the social ladder, shame may have carried less sting than a beating. As you stand quietly among the onlookers, both interpretations seem to hover in the air. The sensory details are subdued but constant. The sun slowly creeps across the square, warming your face, then the top of the restrained person's head. Flies buzz lazily. Someone laughs, not loudly, just enough to be heard, and that soft sound feels sharper than any shout. You notice how often punishment relies on the crowd to do its work. Rome doesn't need to supply cruelty, it just creates the conditions for it to appear. A quirky tidbit slips in like a whispered aside. Sometimes those placed in the stocks wore placards listing their crimes. Illiteracy didn't always save them, because someone in the crowd would happily read it aloud. The sign wasn't for information, it was for labeling. Once labeled, you could be reduced to a single bad act, frozen there alongside your neck and wrists. It's the ancient equivalent of being ratioed publicly, with less Wi-Fi and more splinters. You notice how different people react. Some avert their eyes, pretending intense interest in a nearby column. Others stare openly, as if supervision is part of the civic duty. Children, unburdened by adult discomfort, point and ask questions that parents answer too quickly. Rome teaches early. This is what happens, the silence says, when you forget your place. These punishments linger because they leave time for imagination. With every passerby, the person in the stocks must relive their error, reframed from fresh faces and whispered judgments. The lack of motion is part of the design. Stillness invites scrutiny. You feel oddly tense standing there, as though if you stop moving too long, you might somehow be mistaken for the next exhibit. Historians still argue whether prolonged exposure like this reinforced communal norms or fostered resentment strong enough to erode loyalty. Did the punished return humbled or hardened? The sources don't agree, and perhaps the truth changed from person to person, just as it would now. Shame, after all, is slippery. It can correct behavior, or it can calcify bitterness. The square slowly empties and refills as the hours crawl by. The person in the stocks remains, anchored to the same patch of ground while the day advances around them. That contrast is striking. Life moves, but you do not. The punishment isn't about stopping the world, it's about freezing you inside it. There's a peculiar calm to the scene. No shouting, no struggle, just exposure, time, and the quiet weight of collective attention. You realize Rome understands something very human here. Most people fear being seen badly more than being hurt briefly. The stocks weaponize that fear with architectural simplicity. A soft moment of dark humor drifts through your thoughts. At least with the stocks, there's no paperwork. Rome's efficiency shines again. But behind that joke is a sharper realization. This punishment requires the public's participation. Without onlookers, it loses much of its bite. You, by standing here, are part of it, whether you like it or not. As you finally move on, the image lingers. Sun, wood, murmuring voices, a body turned into a message. It's a punishment that leaves no visible scars, yet can follow someone for a lifetime. And as your steps carry you away, you sense how deeply Rome understands the power of shame, an understanding that echoes long after the square fades from view. You drift farther from the crowded squares now,
toward the edges of the city where the buildings thin and the air feels a little less dense with opinion. Here, the punishments aren't loud or immediate. They're quieter, slower, and in some ways more final. This is where you begin to feel the strange weight of exile, a sentence that doesn't wound the body but carefully dismantles a life. Exile was a common punishment in ancient Rome, especially for citizens and elites who were too well connected to harm openly. Rather than execution, offenders might be banished from Rome entirely or restricted to a distant island or province. The Romans called some versions relegatio or deportatio, and the difference mattered deeply. One was temporary and allowed property to remain intact, the other was permanent and far more devastating. As you walk, you imagine what that would feel like. No public spectacle, no crowd, just an order, delivered calmly, that removes you from everything familiar: home, friends, the rhythm of daily life. In a society where identity is tightly tied to public presence, absence becomes its own kind of punishment. You're not erased violently, you're edited out. Historians still argue whether exile was viewed as merciful or cruel. Some ancient writers praised it as a humane alternative to death, offering the condemned at least the chance to live. Others described it as a living death, especially when exile meant isolated islands with limited resources and little contact. Standing near the city's boundary, it's easy to understand how both interpretations could be true. The sensory contrast is stark. Instead of shouts and crowds, you hear wind rustling outside the walls, carts on distant roads, the muted sounds of departure. Exile begins with movement away from noise and toward silence. That silence can stretch for years. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you think about those islands. Some of Rome's preferred exile destinations were small, rocky outcrops in the Mediterranean, places better suited to seabirds than senators. The idea wasn't comfort, it was separation. You could live, yes, but far enough away that your influence dissolved naturally. No speeches, no supporters, just salt air and too much time to think. You glance back toward Rome, imagining the city shrinking in your view as the road carries you away. Exile punished reputation as much as proximity. You couldn't participate in politics, rituals, or even regular social interactions. You became a former presence, someone people spoke about in the past tense. For a culture obsessed with legacy and honor, that loss cut deep. Historians still argue whether elite Romans feared exile more than death. Letters from banished figures suggest profound grief, even despair, over separation from civic life. Yet others adapted, forming small communities and continuing intellectual work in isolation. Perhaps exile revealed personality as much as it imposed suffering. There's a soft irony here. Rome, so fond of making examples, uses exile to remove examples entirely. The punishment works not by visibility, but by absence. It's justice without an audience, relying on the fear of erasure rather than pain. In a way, it might have been perfect for those who valued status above all else. A gentle moment of humor sneaks in as you imagine a Roman magistrate thinking, "You're not worth the trouble of the stocks." Cold comfort, that. But it highlights Rome's flexibility. Punishment tailored to class and convenience, always efficient in its own stern way. You consider how exile reshaped families, not just individuals. Wives, children, and dependents were often left behind, navigating diminished status and whispering neighbors. Punishment rippled outward, quiet but persistent. Rome understood collateral effects long before the term existed. As you continue along the road, watching the sun dip slightly lower, exile begins to feel heavier with every step. It's a punishment that unfolds slowly, like a shadow lengthening. There's no single moment of release or completion. You simply wake up one day, very far from who you used to be. Historians still argue whether exile functioned less as moral correction and more as political control. Removing rivals without bloodshed kept the streets calm while consolidating power. If so, exile wasn't just punishment, it was strategy. And Rome was nothing if not strategic. You stop and look back one last time before the road bends. The city hums on, indifferent to who stays or goes. That's the final sting of exile. Rome doesn't chase you. It doesn't mourn you. It simply keeps moving, leaving you to carry the memory of belonging on your own. As your steps guide you forward, that sense of quiet loss settles in, slower and sneakier than pain. And as your breathing evens out, you can feel why exile, despite its calm surface, counted among Rome's most effective punishments. It didn't need chains or crowds. It just needed distance and time. You find yourself drawn next toward the outskirts again, but this time not to the silence of departure. Instead, you hear a different sound long before you see its source, the dull, steady rhythm of work. Metal striking stone, voices calling distances and measurements. There's no ceremony here, no crowd gathered for entertainment. This is punishment measured in days, years, and muscle fatigue, forced labor. One mainstream historical fact eases into your awareness. Ancient Rome regularly sentenced criminals, prisoners of war, and enslaved people to hard labor, especially in mines, quarries, and large public construction projects. These sentences weren't framed as employment or service. They were explicitly punitive, often brutal, and sometimes effectively life-ending without technically being an execution. You approach a quarry, white stone catching the sun so brightly it makes you squint. The air is thick with dust, settling into hair, lungs, clothing. Men pause only briefly between swings of iron tools, their movements economical and practiced. Efficiency matters because exhaustion doesn't excuse delay. You notice how discipline here doesn't rely on public shame or witnesses. The work itself is the punishment. Historians still argue whether forced labor sentences were primarily about economic gain or moral correction. On one hand, Rome benefited enormously from cheap, coerced labor. Roads, aqueducts, temples, all rising from exhausted hands. On the other, legal texts describe labor as a corrective process, a way to discipline bodies and souls through relentless effort. Truthfully, Rome probably enjoyed not having to choose. The sensory weight of the place is heavy. Heat clings to your skin. Dust makes every breath effortful. There's a faint metallic taste that you can't quite place, and it's probably better that way. Compared to the sharp moments of the stocks or the suddenness of flogging, this feels endless. Punishment stretched thin, diluted across time, until it becomes a backdrop to existence itself. A lesser-known tidbit wanders quietly into your thoughts. Some forced labor sentences specified the type of work based on perceived suitability. Strong bodies to mines, others to road building or drainage projects. Rome categorized human beings like tools, assigning tasks not for rehabilitation but for maximum output. Personalized punishment Roman style, very efficient, very cold. You pause near a group hauling stone blocks, their coordination tight, practiced through necessity. Overseers are present but not loud. There's no need. Systems enforce themselves when escape is unlikely and consequences well understood. You realize this kind of punishment doesn't need spectacle. It counts on isolation, exhaustion, and the quiet knowledge that tomorrow will look exactly the same. Historians still argue whether sentences to mines were understood as de facto death penalties. Survival rates varied, but ancient sources often described these places with dread. Some prisoners didn't last long under the conditions. Others endured for years, bodies gradually reshaped by labor. It wasn't instant destruction, it was slow attrition. As you watch, you notice something unexpectedly calming in the repetition. Swing, lift, drag. Swing, lift, drag. There's a rhythm to it that almost lulls the mind. Perhaps that's how some survived, by shrinking their world to the next movement, the next breath. You understand how monotony itself becomes a tool of discipline, wearing down resistance quietly. A moment of dry humor drifts in despite yourself. Rome, master of infrastructure, built wonders on deeply unrelaxed backs. Every smooth road hides a long trail of blisters. It's a reminder that civilization often looks elegant from a distance and very tiring up close. As the day advances, shadows shift across the quarry floor. There's no applause, no recognition when goals are met. Completion doesn't mean freedom, it just means more work tomorrow. You feel an unexpected heaviness in your chest, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of inevitability. Historians still argue whether forced labor deterred crime effectively. Some suggest the fear of endless toil was a powerful motivator. Others argue desperation and inequality meant many had little choice regardless of consequences. Watching the workers now, you sense how punishment and economics blur until they're indistinguishable. You step back, letting the sounds fade into the distance. Compared to the visible shame of the stocks or the finality of exile, forced labor sits somewhere in between. You're neither erased nor centered. You're consumed by the machine of empire, transformed into output measured in stone and distance. As you move on, the rhythm of work lingers in your ears, merging with your own footsteps. It's steady, hypnotic, and oddly soothing as it fades. And with each step, you understand why Rome relied so heavily on this punishment. It required no stage, no audience, just time, effort, and the quiet certainty that the work would never truly be finished. You drift back toward the more crowded parts of the city again, drawn by a familiar swell of voices that sounds oddly cheerful given everything you've already seen. There's laughter somewhere ahead, and for a moment you wonder if you've simply wandered into a festival by mistake. But as you get closer, you remember where you are. In Rome, amusement and punishment have a way of sharing the same space. Public humiliation was not just a side effect of punishment in ancient Rome. It was often the primary goal. Authorities intentionally designed penalties that invited ridicule, using costumes, props, and staged scenarios to turn wrongdoing into a lesson that stuck. The logic was simple. People remember what makes them laugh or cringe. You slow down near a small but lively crowd gathered around a temporary platform. At its center stands someone dressed in clothing that is clearly wrong. Ill-fitting, exaggerated, maybe backward or mismatched. Nothing obscene, just ridiculous. The effect is immediate. Smirks ripple through the onlookers. This isn't about pain, it's about stripping someone of seriousness, turning them into a walking punchline. Historians still argue whether these humiliations were more effective than physical punishment. Some believe ridicule penetrated deeper than fear, embedding shame into memory with surprising force. Others suggest it risked undermining authority by turning justice into farce. Watching the scene now, you can feel both dynamics at play, balanced on a tightrope between lesson and mockery. The sensory atmosphere is lighter here. Voices overlap, someone sells snacks nearby. The sun catches bright fabric and polished wood. Compared to the quarry's dust or the quiet cruelty of the stocks, this feels almost playful, and that contrast is unsettling in its own distinct way. Rome doesn't need to hurt you when it can make you laughable. A quirky tidbit slips into the moment. Some punishments reportedly required offenders to parade through streets wearing signs or costumes symbolizing their crime. A dishonest merchant might be dressed to look like a fool. A fraudulent official might wear exaggerated regal garments. The humor wasn't accidental. It was designed, curated, weaponized. You notice how easily the crowd participates. Laughter flows without much prompting, like water downhill. People point, exchange comments, repeat jokes they didn't invent. There's a strange comfort in shared ridicule. It bonds the observers together, reinforcing unspoken norms. We are not them. We know better. We belong. Historians still argue whether this kind of punishment promoted moral clarity or simply provided sanctioned cruelty. Did the crowd walk away feeling more ethical or just entertained? As your gaze drifts across smiling faces, you suspect the answer depends on who's asking and who might one day end up on the platform. The person being humiliated stands there, enduring not blows,
but attention. That may be worse. Attention has weight. It lingers. You imagine stepping down later, knowing that your neighbors will remember not just your mistake, but the laugh attached to it. Reputation in Rome isn't wounded here, it's branded. A soft thread of dark humor curls up in your thoughts. This feels uncomfortably like an ancient open mic night nobody signed up for. But Rome, ever practical, knows ridicule is cheap. No tools needed, no labor loss, just a costume and a crowd. Efficiency again, wearing a grin. As the scene continues, you notice something subtle. Children laugh most freely, unburdened by consequences. Adults laugh too, but with glances that suggest calculation. Humor educates differently depending on age. Rome plants these social lessons early, hoping they put down roots. Historians still argue whether these public humiliations were uniformly applied or varied by region and era. Evidence suggests local officials adapted them creatively, leaning into what their communities responded to best. Punishment here isn't rigid, it's flexible, tailored to the audience. That adaptability helps explain Rome's long control over diverse populations. Eventually, the laughter fades. The punishment ends, not with a clear signal, but with collective disinterest. People wander off, jokes already softening into memory. The person steps down, changed not in body, but in standing. You can almost feel their relief mixed with dread about tomorrow. You move away too, the echoes of laughter trailing behind you like uneven footsteps. Compared to shackles or exile, this punishment feels strangely light, and yet it follows a person everywhere. Comedy, it turns out, is one of Rome's sharpest tools. As your pace slows and breathing settles, you feel how humiliation operates quietly, efficiently, and deeply. Not all punishments leave marks on the skin. Some sink into the social fabric and stay there, tugging gently each time you pass a familiar face. And as the city carries on around you, that realization stays close, drifting with you into the next shadowed street. You wander farther still, toward an area that feels heavier even before you understand why. The crowd here gathers with less chatter and more intention, voices lowered, movements cautious. Something about animals always shifts a mood, especially when they're not here to be admired. Cages creak softly nearby, and that sound alone tells you this punishment is meant to unsettle. A mainstream historical fact settles into your awareness. Ancient Roman law sometimes incorporated animals directly into punitive rituals, using them as symbols, tools, or executioners. These punishments weren't random. They were carefully chosen to communicate meaning about crime, order, and cosmic balance. Rome loved symbolism almost as much as it loved control. You stand near a fenced area where large shapes move restlessly in the shade. Not exotic today, perhaps. Dogs, livestock, but the way they're positioned, restrained, and observed turns them into something more. They're not just animals anymore. They're part of the legal process. That transformation feels distinctly Roman, turning nature itself into an accessory of law. Historians still argue whether these animal-linked punishments were genuinely common or exaggerated by later writers eager for spectacle. Some sources describe them vividly, while archaeological evidence remains sparse. Still, enough reliable accounts exist to believe they were part of Rome's punitive imagination, even if not an everyday occurrence. The atmosphere feels charged. People keep their distance, eyes drawn despite themselves. Animals capture attention in a way tools don't. You hear snorts, claws scratching earth, the occasional low growl. Nothing dramatic happens yet, and that anticipation stretches time, making each breath louder in your ears. A quirky tidbit floats gently into view. Romans often assigned symbolic meaning to animals. Wolves signifying ferocity, dogs loyalty or degradation, serpents treachery.
Using animals in punishment tapped into layers of cultural understanding. It wasn't just fear of claws or teeth, it was fear of becoming something less than human, reduced to prey or spectacle. You notice how officials handle the situation with ritual calm. Commands are measured, movements deliberate. This isn't chaos, it's choreography. The animals don't decide justice, they enact it. Rome maintains the illusion of order even when outsourcing violence to nature. Historians still argue whether victims experienced greater terror from the animals themselves or from the crowd's anticipation. The presence of living creatures makes outcomes feel less controlled, more primal. That unpredictability may have been part of the point. Rome reminds you here that law can unleash forces bigger than any individual. Despite the tension, there's a strange quietness to the crowd. Less laughter, fewer comments. Animal punishments draw a more somber response, as if something deeper has been stirred. The line between civilization and wilderness blurs, and nobody seems quite sure how to feel about that. A soft, grim humor flickers briefly in your mind. Rome, master organizer, turns even beasts into civil servants. But the joke doesn't linger long. The setting doesn't invite it. As the punishment reaches its end, without details your tired mind doesn't need, the crowd exhales collectively, like waking from a shared dream. People don't rush forward, they drift back, thoughtful, quieter than before. The animals are removed, the space cleared, the earth scuffed smooth again, as if resetting the scene. Historians still argue whether these punishments reinforce the idea of divine justice, animals acting as instruments of fate, or undermined Rome's claim to rational governance. Perhaps they did both. Religion, law, and fear intertwine easily here, each propping up the other when needed. You step away slowly, the sounds of cages fading behind you. Compared to ridicule or forced labor, this punishment feels ancient in a deeper sense, tapping into instincts older than cities. It leaves no room for debate or reflection in the moment. Only afterward does the meaning settle in. As you walk, your thoughts grow softer. The image of restless shapes behind bars blurs, dissolving into a general sense of unease that gradually ebbs. Rome has shown you yet another way it asserts control, not just over people, but over symbols, instincts, and the natural world itself. You breathe out, steadying yourself. The city continues, indifferent and vast. And as the last echo of animal movement fades from your imagination, you sense how these punishments linger long after they end, precisely because they reach somewhere deeper than fear, into myth, memory, and the quiet animal part of the mind. You move closer to the water now, following a road that slopes gently downward, the air growing cooler and more open with every step. The city doesn't disappear behind you, but it loosens its grip, like a hand relaxing after holding too tight. Somewhere ahead, waves lap softly against stone. Rome, it turns out, likes to end some of its most symbolic punishments right where land gives up and sea takes over. A mainstream historical fact, one of the most infamous Roman punishments was pona culae, the penalty of the sack. Traditionally reserved for those convicted of murdering a close family member, especially a parent, this punishment involved binding the condemned, placing them inside a sack with animals, and casting the sack into water. It was rare, ritualized, and heavy with meaning. You pause near the edge, listening to water slap against the harbor wall in an uneven, almost sleepy rhythm. It's oddly calming, which feels wrong given what you know is associated with this place. The Romans understood symbolism well, and this punishment was less about spectacle and more about cosmic correction. Killing a parent wasn't just a crime, it violated the natural order, so the response had to be equally unnatural. Historians still argue how consistently pona culae was carried out in practice. Some believe it was more often threatened than performed, a legal extreme meant to underline the severity of the crime. Others point to specific cases and legal texts suggesting it remained a real, if uncommon, sentence over centuries. As with many Roman punishments, its power may have lain as much in the idea as in the act. The animals involved carried meaning: a dog, a rooster, a snake, sometimes a monkey, creatures symbolizing chaos, impurity, or broken bonds. They weren't random. The condemned wasn't just being executed, they were being symbolically expelled from the human order entirely. Bound and sealed, denied even the dignity of burial, the offender was returned to the elements as something no longer fully human. A strange, almost surreal tidbit comes to mind. Romans believed proper burial was essential for peace in the afterlife. To deny that was to extend punishment beyond death. Being cast into the sea inside a sack accomplished exactly that. The body vanished, the soul wandered, and the family lineage remained stained. It's a punishment that ripples forward and backward in time at once. The sensory scene is subdued. You don't imagine screaming crowds here, just officials, a few witnesses, and the restless water waiting without judgment. Compared to the forum's noise or the quarry's labor, this is quiet and final. The sea doesn't need instruction. It accepts what it's given and moves on. Historians still argue whether Romans felt revulsion or righteousness when witnessing such sentences. Legal writers framed the punishment as necessary and just, but personal reactions are harder to recover. Standing here now, you sense both would have coexisted: relief that order was restored and discomfort at the method used to do it. Rome rarely chose between the two. A gentle thread of dark humor floats briefly through your tired mind. If Rome ever wanted to make absolutely sure someone didn't come back for a sequel, this was the way. But the joke dissolves almost immediately. There's something about the finality of water that resists levity. You watch a small boat drift past, mundane and peaceful, and feel the odd tension between everyday life and ritual death. The harbor isn't a place frozen in horror. It's busy, practical, necessary. That juxtaposition is classic Rome, life continuing right beside punishment, neither stopping for the other. The deeper meaning here is separation, not just from life, but from land, from lineage, from memory. Casting someone into the sea stripped away connection. No grave to visit, no marker, just absence. Compared to Exile, where memory lingers painfully, this erasure is absolute. Historians still argue whether Coeli represents Rome at its most symbolic or its most excessive. Was it a carefully constructed moral statement or an example of how far ritual can go when law blends with superstition? You suspect the answer is, again, both. As you step back from the water, the sound of waves softens, becoming almost hypnotic. It's easy, if you let it be, to drift into that rhythm, letting details blur. Sack, sea, silence. The images lose their edges, turning into a general sense of heaviness that slowly fades. You move on, leaving the harbor behind, carrying with you the knowledge that some punishments were designed not to teach the living, but to symbolically repair the universe itself. And as your footsteps grow slower and your breathing steadier, the sea's rhythm follows you inward, smoothing the sharpness of the thought until all that remains is motion, and then calm. You trudge down the narrow, sun-baked streets of Rome, feeling the cobblestones shift slightly beneath your sandals, and notice a small, unassuming doorway flanked by columns worn smooth by centuries of hands brushing against them. Today, your journey takes you to one of the stranger facets of Roman justice, the peculiar punishment known as the coeli, or sack punishment, reserved for parricides, those who dared to kill a parent. It is a case of law that straddles the line between horror and ritualized symbolism, a punishment that literally carries the weight of myth and fear. You imagine the condemned, trembling not merely at the law itself, but at the strange theater of the sentence that awaits them. You step closer and almost feel the rough texture of a heavy sack, the kind that would later swallow a human body along with an assortment of live animals. The Romans, in their practical yet theatrical approach to crime, didn't just want to execute the guilty, They wanted to send a message that was impossible to forget. In the Pona Kulai, the convicted parricide would be sewn into a leather or linen sack, sometimes accompanied by a monkey, a snake, a dog, and a rooster. These animals were not random. Historians still argue whether each was chosen for symbolic resonance: the monkey for human folly, the snake for cunning, the dog for loyalty violated, the rooster perhaps as a call to watchfulness, or if the selection varied by magistrate whim. Either way, the resulting bundle became a living emblem of chaos, an inversion of natural order. You can almost hear the faint rustling inside the sack, the faint clatter of claws and beaks as the condemned adjusts to an impossible reality. The punishment was then cast into the Tiber River, a watery grave designed to erase the criminal both physically and socially. The river, a lifeline for Rome and daily commerce and mundane travel, became a conduit for justice, an eerie reminder that even the familiar currents could carry away the consequences of human misdeeds. Scholars debate whether the drowning was meant solely as execution or as a symbolic cleansing, a liquid severing of familial bonds and social ties. You imagine leaning over the riverbank, feeling the cool breeze that mingles with the pungent scent of the water, and wondering if on a quiet night you might hear the faint echoes of past splashes, ritualistically marking the end of a life that transgressed the deepest social taboo. It's worth noting, amid the grim mechanics of this punishment, that the Pona Kale was rare and reserved for a very specific kind of crime. The Romans had a legal sophistication that allowed for gradations of crime and punishment, and the sack was extreme even by their standards. You might picture a magistrate consulting scrolls, nodding gravely, aware that this spectacle would linger in the memories of witnesses, a lesson as enduring as the marble columns framing the forum. Theatrics and law intertwined seamlessly, producing a system that could terrify and educate simultaneously. And yet, you notice, the fascination with this method endured well beyond the Republic. Emperors, and later Roman commentators, still recounted the Pona Kulai, sometimes embellishing details, sometimes questioning its morality, giving historians a tangled narrative to unpack centuries later. As you wander further down these imagined streets, you find yourself musing over the sensory contradictions inherent in this punishment. You can almost feel the tactile tension of the leather sack, heavy and unyielding, and smell the faint musk of the animals, all while listening to the soft lapping of the Tiber. There's an odd, almost dreamlike quality to imagining the condemned floating away, a human presence diminished by ritual, yet amplified in memory and record. Modern readers often recoil at the literal violence, but there's an undeniable artistry to the orchestration. The Romans, in blending punishment, myth, and spectacle, created a justice that was unforgettable. You might chuckle quietly, imagining the monkey or rooster contributing a final comic note to an otherwise somber sentence. Dark humor that perhaps softened the grief of the observers, or at least helped them digest the spectacle. The Poena Cully also invites reflection on human psychology. You consider what it must have been like for witnesses, watching someone disappear into a bag with animals, the river swallowing the scene, leaving only ripples. It's a vivid reminder that ancient justice was as much about shaping perception and reinforcing social norms as it was about retribution. Scholars still argue whether these punishments were more performative than penal, a kind of state-sponsored storytelling meant to instill fear and obedience. Walking through this mental landscape, you sense the paradox, cruelty and care interwoven, the law seeking both to punish and to maintain cosmic order, a subtle, almost hypnotic choreography that guides the imagination long after the act itself has vanished into history. And then, your mind drifts to the peculiar rituals surrounding execution days. Families of the accused might be barred, friends might watch in silent horror or morbid fascination. Perhaps a magistrate took careful notes, recording every detail as though composing a moral tale for future generations. You, of course, are merely an observer, standing on the banks of time,
feeling the cool breeze mix with the ancient aroma of wet stone and riverweed, your mind wandering gently through scenarios that are distant yet vivid.
Even in imagining such extremities, the tone remains soft, almost meditative, as if the river itself carries away not just the condemned, but the tension in your chest, the suspense that builds in quiet curiosity. So, as you step back from the riverbank, brushing your fingers against smooth stones, you notice a lingering echo. Justice in Rome was never merely a procedural matter. It was art, ritual, spectacle, and moral instruction all at once. And while the Puna Cullae may seem bizarre or terrifying from a modern perspective, within the context of Roman society, it served as a carefully constructed moral theater, a warning sewn into leather, cast into water, and remembered through generations. You let your eyes close briefly, imagining the ripples expanding across the Tiber, the soft rustling of fur and feathers fading into memory, a sleepy lesson on the extremes of human creativity in law and punishment. You continue your slow stroll through the imagined streets of ancient Rome, the fading sunlight turning the white marble buildings a soft amber, and your mind drifts to another curious corner of Roman justice, the use of the tunica molesta, or the flaming tunic. Unlike the sack punishment, this method was theatrical in a more direct, almost cinematic sense. You picture the condemned, often slaves, arsonists, or other criminals deemed especially dangerous, draped in a tunic treated with pitch or resin, set alight in the forum while citizens watched. There's a peculiar choreography to it, the careful placement, the igniting of flames, the crowd's murmuring that rises into a unified tension. It is punishment, yes, but also spectacle, a ritualized display designed to imprint on the social imagination a sense of what happens to those who violate divine and civic laws. You trudge closer, imagining the smell of burning resin mixed with sweat and dust, a sensory detail that lingers in memory long after the story is told. Interestingly, historians still argue whether the flaming tunic was always fatal, or if, in some instances, the condemned were given a slim chance to escape or endure for a brief period, a form of symbolic warning more than execution. You imagine the careful balancing act between cruelty and theatricality. The law needed to demonstrate its power without descending into chaos. It's a bit like a stage play where everyone knows the ending, but the journey there is designed to grip the audience, even as they feel a strange, almost meditative tension in their bodies. You might shiver, not from fear, but from the vividness of imagining a flame dancing across fabric, its unpredictable patterns reflecting human vulnerability in a society obsessed with order. The flaming tunic also carried cultural resonance. Rome's fascination with fire is well documented, from the Vestal virgins tending eternal flames to the symbolic purging of corruption through controlled conflagration. In some cases, the tunica molesta punishment was reserved for arsonists, a literal inversion of their crime. Those who brought fire upon the city were engulfed in its symbolic reflection. Quirky tidbits survive in ancient anecdotes. One account mentions that in certain festivals, mock tunics were burned as theatrical practice, a softening rehearsal for the real horrors, or perhaps a way for citizens to engage with the spectacle without the finality of death. You imagine the faint crackle, the smoke curling into the warm Roman sky, and wonder at the psychology behind a society that could blend punishment, ritual, and public entertainment so seamlessly. Walking further, you notice the juxtaposition of justice and everyday life. Merchants pack up their stalls, the aroma of bread and olives drifts in the air, and children scamper through narrow alleyways oblivious to the human drama unfolding just beyond. Scholars still argue whether these public punishments served as an effective deterrent, or whether the spectacle sometimes desensitized the populace, turning real suffering into a form of morbid amusement. You feel the contradiction in your chest, a gentle dissonance that mirrors the human condition itself. empathy coexisting with curiosity, horror softened by distance and reflection. You feel the contradiction in your chest, a gentle dissonance that mirrors the human condition itself. Empathy coexisting with curiosity, horror softened by distance and reflection. It's as if the city itself breathes with the rhythm of punishment, each event a note in a vast symphony of social control and moral instruction. The sensory layers continue to accumulate. You feel the warmth radiating from the cobblestones, smell the faint scent of oil lamps flickering in side streets, hear the murmur of citizens debating the morality of the punishment. You notice a light breeze that carries the tang of smoke, even in your imagination, a reminder that the past is never entirely clean, that remnants of human experience cling to every corner of memory. Light jokes creep into your mind, not to trivialize, but to keep the narrative gentle. Perhaps you imagine the condemned, puffing nervously as their tunic ignites, wishing they had picked a fashion choice less flammable. A small, almost absurd thought that softens the edges of terror. Humor, after all, is a gentle tool to bridge the gap between historical horror and present-day curiosity. You pause by a fountain, its water sparkling in the last light, and reflect on the broader context of Roman capital punishments. The flaming tunic was not an isolated practice, but part of a spectrum that ranged from fines and beatings to exotic executions like the ponacule. Each method communicated social values, deterrence, and moral order in a uniquely Roman way. There's something meditative in tracing these threads, imagining the interplay of law, public spectacle, and personal consequence. You almost feel the rhythm of the city, the careful cadence of magistrates' proclamations, the murmuring of citizens, the occasional shout of a child, each layer blending into a soothing, continuous hum that guides your imagination gently forward. Finally, you consider the legacy of such punishments. They linger in memory, not just as stories of cruelty, but as evidence of Roman ingenuity in ritualized law enforcement. The flaming tunic, with its mix of danger, symbolism, and spectacle, teaches a subtle lesson about the interplay of fear, morality, and community attention. You let your mind drift, imagining the last flickers of flame dissipating into smoke that curls into the twilight sky, leaving only the soft sounds of the city to fill the quiet gaps. It's a gentle reminder that history, even in its more bizarre forms, can be observed and reflected upon without urgency, letting the mind wander safely along the currents of imagination, guided by curiosity and the calming cadence of storytelling. You meander along the quiet, lantern-lit streets of your mind's Rome, letting the shadows stretch and lengthen and settle into another peculiar corner of Roman punitive creativity, the infamous pona capiti suspendenda, or hanging by the head. It's a punishment that feels almost surreal in its simplicity, yet leaves a lingering mark on memory. One of those historical oddities that seems designed as much for spectacle as for retribution. Imagine a scaffold rising gently above a plaza, the warm glow of the setting sun highlighting the grain of the wood, and a crowd gathering, not in anger exactly, but in that quiet, curious anticipation that humanity has long had for witnessing the unusual. This method, often applied to those guilty of treason or extreme disrespect toward the state, involved suspending the condemned upside down by the head, sometimes in a sack or with additional restraints. Gravity worked as both a tool and a tormentor, pressing the body into awkward, unnatural positions. You can almost feel the tug of blood toward the head, the inversion of familiar sensation, and perhaps hear the faint murmur of the crowd, a low hum of collective fascination mixed with unease. Historians still argue whether this punishment was meant to cause long-term suffering, a slow demonstration of humiliation, or simply to render the guilty a visual lesson for the community. You notice how these debates underscore the duality of Roman justice, efficiency and symbolism intertwined, producing outcomes that were as memorable as they were grim. As you imagine yourself standing nearby, you can almost smell the tang of polished wood, the subtle aroma of dust and stone, and the faint sweat of onlookers pressed into the packed plaza. There's something almost theatrical about it, a choreography that balances punishment and public performance. Fringe accounts suggest that some magistrates even added small comedic elements, like letting birds perch on the suspended individual, or strategically placing a basin of water just out of reach, blending discomfort with absurdity. You might grin quietly, imagining a pigeon strutting across the toes of the condemned, a tiny, indifferent actor in a very serious play. Humor here is a gentle lens, a way to soften the edge of human cruelty without ignoring its existence. The broader cultural resonance of this punishment is fascinating. Rome, with its obsession for hierarchy, law, and social signaling, often chose methods that reflected the crime itself. Suspension by the head inverted the natural order, a symbolic mirror of the societal disruption the offender had caused. You trace the mental image further. The crowd, attentive but restrained, children peering around parents' legs, merchants packing up nearby stalls, the scent of roasted bread and wine wafting lazily through the streets. The punishment is simultaneously intimate and public, a quiet yet inescapable reminder of authority. You notice how the sensory tapestry, smell, sight, subtle movements of wind through the plaza, softens the imagination, letting it linger without panic, maintaining the meditative cadence necessary for a bedtime journey. Even in imagining the mechanics of such punishment, there's an intriguing interplay of human perception and law. The physical discomfort was just one layer. The psychological impact, the subtle social messaging, was equally potent. You might picture whispers among the crowd, speculative conversations about the offender's motives, exaggerated tales of the suspension reaching other parts of the city. Scholars still argue how much of the drama was orchestrated versus spontaneous. The line between theater and justice blurs, a gentle reminder that humans have always been drawn to narratives, even when they are uncomfortable. As you wander farther in your mind's Rome, you notice parallels with other Roman punishments. The inverted suspension echoes the symbolic inversions of the pena collae, the flaming tunic, and the use of public spaces as stages. There's a consistent motif of exaggeration, of amplifying minor acts into memorable spectacles, designed to reinforce morality, law, and social cohesion. You might smile faintly, thinking of how the condemned probably had less control over their story than anyone watching, yet their experience became a teaching tool, a narrative stretched across memory like a gentle, albeit unsettling, cautionary tale. Finally, you let the imagined scene soften, the plank and ropes fading into twilight, replaced by the gentle murmur of distant fountains, the rustling of olive trees, and the muted clatter of evening commerce. The lesson of the poena capiti suspendenda drifts with the warm air. Even the bizarre extremes of Roman justice were constructed with intent, blending gravity and symbolism, discomfort and moral theater. You close your eyes briefly, letting the visual fade like smoke in a still courtyard, and feel the narrative's gentle rhythm guide you forward, a soft pulse of curiosity and wonder that carries you effortlessly into the next corner of history, your thoughts floating like leaves on the Tiber's calm surface. You drift further through the imagined, lamplit streets of Rome, feeling the soft unevenness of cobblestones beneath your sandals, and arrive at yet another peculiar facet of Roman justice, the curious use of the curse tablet punishments. These are subtler, less physically dramatic than the flaming tunic or sack punishment, but they carry a strange, almost intimate power. Imagine yourself entering a quiet courtyard, the scent of clay, oil lamps, and damp stone mingling in the evening air, and spotting a small slab of lead, etched with tiny, meticulous letters. This is a defixio, a curse tablet, meant to summon supernatural forces to punish someone, often a thief, a rival, or a deceitful acquaintance. In many ways, it represents the psychological side of Roman punishment. Instead of relying solely on magistrates, it enlists the divine or mystical as a partner in justice. You picture a trembling hand inscribing the tablet with pointed precision, the scratching of metal against lead a faint, hypnotic rhythm. Romans believed that once the curse was activated, folded, nailed, or placed in sacred waters, it could cause misfortune, illness, or social ruin to the target. Fringe evidence suggests that some tablets even included miniature effigies of the offender, sometimes pierced with pins or bound with string, a tactile, symbolic extension of the curse. Historians still argue whether these rituals were meant more as psychological deterrents, reinforcing the social norms through fear of divine retribution, or if they reflected a genuine belief in supernatural intervention. Either way, the sensation is curious. The punishment is both invisible and deeply personal, a whispered echo of justice in a world dominated by spectacle. You meander through your mental courtyard, imagining the faint metallic scent, the cool touch of lead, and the hushed whisperings of neighbors who might witness the ritual. Unlike public executions, these punishments are intimate, secretive, yet they resonate through the social fabric. Perhaps the condemned never even knows that a tablet exists, and yet the act of cursing someone engages both the cursor's mind and the imagined consequences in a peculiar form of moral theater. Lightly, you imagine someone in the crowd accidentally dropping their own tablet into a fountain, eliciting a soft, unintended magical misfire. History has its moments of humor tucked into its solemnities, and Rome certainly was not immune. The use of curse tablets also reflects a cultural layering of law, religion, and personal grievance. The Romans often intertwined civic law with religious practice. Invoking divine justice was an extension of human authority. You can picture a marketplace. It smells of bread, wine, and fish blending with the soft murmur of citizens, and someone discreetly slipping their tablet into a sacred spring. The act is unassuming, almost meditative, yet it carries a weighty sense of intention. Scholars still argue about the prevalence of this practice, whether it was more common among the urban poor or spread evenly across social classes. But the surviving artifacts provide a tantalizing glimpse into everyday anxieties and the creative ways Romans sought to exert control. As you wander farther, the mental scene softens into a warm, contemplative glow. You imagine tracing your fingers over the etched letters, feeling the cool metal against your skin, and sensing the connection between human emotion, ritual, and social expectation. The punishment is slow, almost invisible, and yet profoundly affecting. An internal echo of consequences, a gentle tug on the moral fabric. You smile softly at the irony. The Romans, with their grand theaters of law and brutal public punishments, also embraced this quiet, mysterious form of justice. In imagining these acts, you sense the rhythm of history's whisper, the way human societies have always blended creativity, belief, and morality into their systems of punishment. Finally, you allow the courtyard to fade into memory, replaced by the soft murmur of evening Rome, water trickling in fountains, the gentle shuffle of feet, the distant crow of a rooster. The curse tablet, subtle and strange, leaves a lingering lesson. Not all justice requires spectacle or physical force. Sometimes the mind itself becomes the stage, imagination and belief intertwining in ways that shape both action and perception. And as you drift through this scene, you feel the meditative cadence of the narrative guiding you gently, a soothing rhythm that carries you onward, deeper into the bizarre, fascinating world of Roman punishments. You wander slowly along the imagined pathways of ancient Rome, the faint scent of olive oil and baked bread drifting from the nearby markets, and let your mind settle on one of the more unusual forms of punishment, being sewn into animal skins, or poena pellicus. This method, often reserved for thieves, adulterers, or sometimes those who had insulted the emperor, involved wrapping the condemned in the hide of a wild animal, frequently a dog, a wolf, or even a bear, before public exposure or beating. The Romans, with their characteristic love of symbolism and public moral theater, transformed an already uncomfortable execution into a performance layered with meaning. You can almost feel the coarse, scratchy texture of the hide against skin, the way it would restrict movement and force the body into awkward, unnatural positions. The sensory detail is immediate. The musky scent of the tanned hide mixes with the faint, earthy aroma of nearby streets, and you imagine the rustling sound as the condemned struggles against the bindings, their every motion amplified by the rigidity of the animal skin. Historians still argue whether the choice of animal was symbolic, practical, or sometimes simply a reflection of available resources. One fringe account even mentions the use of multiple hides layered together, creating a bizarre, almost cocoon-like effect, blending fear with spectacle. You notice how this punishment blurs the line between human and animal, an almost metaphysical inversion that underscores the moral and social disorder supposedly caused by the offender. As you move through the imagined scene, the crowd becomes part of the texture. Citizens, perhaps accustomed to the extremes of Roman justice, murmur quietly among themselves. Some might see the punishment as poetic justice, transforming the human body into a living mask of transgression, while others might feel unease, a subtle empathy creeping into their consciousness. Light jokes enter your mind, not to trivialize the suffering, but to soften the narrative. Perhaps a mischievous child whispers to a friend that the condemned now resembles an oversized, very unhappy puppy. Humor, even in a distant, gentle form, helps the imagination navigate historical cruelty without being overwhelmed. The broader cultural context is fascinating. The Romans often designed punishments to reflect the nature of the crime, turning the act into a visual metaphor. Wrapping a thief in a predator's hide, for example, could symbolize the attempt to curb human cunning with animalistic restraint. Scholars still debate whether this practice was more prevalent in rural areas or urban centers, and whether its purpose leaned more toward deterrence or ritual humiliation. The tactile, visual, and symbolic elements all work together, a subtle choreography intended to reinforce social norms and moral expectations. You drift into imagining the aftermath. Perhaps the condemned is paraded through a market square, the coarse hides rubbing and restricting their movement, each step an awkward, visible penance. Merchants continue their routines, the faint aroma of olives and bread blending with the faint metallic tang of anxiety or tension in the air. You sense the gentle cadence of the city's life, the interplay of human experience and ritualized justice, creating a tapestry that feels strangely intimate despite the cruelty. There's almost a meditative quality in envisioning these events. History's strangeness becomes a kind of mental puzzle. Each sensory detail a soft brushstroke painting a vivid yet calming landscape. Finally, you allow the imagery to dissolve into the evening air of your mind. The streets soften, the scent of food lingers faintly, the sound of distant fountains hums in the background. The poena pellicus, bizarre and discomforting as it is, leaves a subtle lesson. Roman punishment was not merely about pain or deterrence, it was a story told in flesh, fabric, and spectacle, designed to linger in memory. You close your eyes briefly, letting the scene fade, feeling the narrative's gentle rhythm carry you forward into the final stretch, a soothing pulse of curiosity and imagination guiding your thoughts toward the wind-down that awaits. You wander now into the final stretch of this peculiar journey through the world of Roman punishments, feeling the soft evening breeze of your imagination brush against the imagined marble facades and lantern-lit streets. Your mind settles on one last, subtly terrifying yet fascinating practice, the pona culae cum serpente, a variant of the sack punishment you've encountered before, but with an added focus on serpents as instruments of symbolic and ritualistic justice. In this version, a parricide, or sometimes a particularly notorious criminal, would be bound in a sack along with one or more snakes, sometimes venomous, sometimes harmless, and then cast into a river or secluded pit. You can almost feel the weight of the sack, rough and unwieldy, and hear the faint hiss of serpents shifting within. A sinister, almost hypnotic soundtrack, that sets the mind on edge without needing graphic detail. The sensory detail is immediate: the damp leather against skin, the cool slip of water beneath, the faint metallic scent of the sack as it absorbs the river, and the subtle, almost imperceptible movement of serpents contained within. Historians still argue whether the snakes were chosen for their symbolic association with cunning, vengeance, or divine retribution, or simply because their presence intensified fear. A fringe account even suggests that in some cases, citizens would place small charms or amulets in the sack to protect the spirit of the condemned, a fascinating intersection of law, superstition, and ritual. You imagine the crowd standing on the riverbank, murmuring softly, watching the ripples swallow the punishment, their curiosity mingled with the faintest hint of reverence for forces beyond human control. As you drift further into the imagined scene, you sense the layering of psychological and social dynamics. The Puena Cule cum Serpente is not just about ending a life. It's a demonstration of cosmic and societal order. The inversion of natural roles, the human, the serpent, the river, creates a story told through physical and symbolic elements. The ritual acts almost like a meditation, a reminder to citizens about boundaries, law, and morality, even as they are entertained or horrified by the spectacle. Light humor flickers in your mind, a snake lazily coiling while the condemned adjusts uncomfortably, a momentary absurdity in an otherwise tense tableau, helping your imagination process the scene without becoming overwhelmed. You notice the continuity with other Roman punishments you've imagined on this journey: the flaming tunic, the curse tablets, the animal hides, the inverted suspensions. Each method shares a rhythmic, deliberate layering of sensation, symbolism, and moral instruction. The Romans, it seems, delighted in designing punishments that operated on multiple levels: physical, psychological, communal, and even mystical. Scholars still debate how effective these punishments were as deterrents versus moral lessons, but the consistency of spectacle across centuries is striking. You imagine children peeking from alleyways, merchants pausing in their routines, citizens whispering as the punishment unfolds, each participant internalizing a lesson wrapped in drama, subtle terror, and human creativity. Now, as you allow the river, the rippling water, and the soft hiss of snakes to fade into the background, your mind drifts toward the conclusion of this strange, soothing exploration. The bizarre practices of Roman justice, so elaborate, symbolic, and sometimes absurd, offer not just historical insight, but a gentle meditation on human imagination, societal control, and the delicate interplay between fear and instruction. You sense the quiet hum of the city fading into twilight, the air softening, and the faint clatter of distant footsteps blending with the whisper of water and leaves. Even in their extremity, these punishments reveal the meticulous artistry of human systems, the thoughtful orchestration of morality and memory. As the story winds down, allow yourself to breathe slowly, feeling the cool air against your skin, noticing the faint warmth of imagined lanterns, and the soft, rhythmic cadence of your own heartbeat. The scenes you've walked through, the flaming tunics, inverted suspensions, curse tablets, animal hides, and serpentine sacks fade gently, leaving only the quiet lessons of creativity, consequence, and imagination. The streets of Rome soften into memory, and you are left with the gentle resonance of curiosity fulfilled, the mind quietly satisfied yet unhurried, the narrative folding in upon itself like a soft blanket over your thoughts. Take one last slow breath. Feel the imagination settle like sediment in a still river. The lights dim, and the soft, almost imperceptible sounds of the city merging with your own internal rhythm. History has been strange tonight, bizarre, even unsettling, but it has been gentle in its cadence. a series of sensory and moral puzzles to ponder softly as sleep draws near. Let your thoughts drift like leaves on calm water, unhurried, unpressured, curious, and calm. The bizarre extremes of Roman justice are now just shadows, reminders of human creativity and ritual, and you are carried softly into a slower, calmer space. And now, as your imagination settles and your body grows heavy, allow the final layers of the story to dissolve into soft, calming whispers. Streets, rivers, flames, and rustling leaves all fade. You are safe, you are comfortable, and the gentle hum of history fades into nothingness, leaving only the soft cadence of your own breathing to guide you into rest. The streets of your imagined Rome soften completely now. The lanterns dim to gentle glows, the cobblestones cool beneath your mental feet. You feel the air carrying the faintest scent of bread, olive oil, and distant herbs, and your mind drifts easily along the quiet waterways and narrow alleys. Each punishment, each bizarre ritual you have wandered through tonight now settles like sediment in the calm river of memory, present but gentle, vivid yet distant, a curious whisper rather than a clamor. You sense the rhythm of the city slowing with you, the bustle fading into a soft meditative pulse, carrying the lessons of history quietly into your mind. The flaming tunics, the inverted suspensions, the curse tablets, the hides, and the serpentine sacks, all the strangeness, the oddity, the symbolic artistry, now float softly in your imagination, their edges blurred, their weight lightened. The human stories behind them are transformed into gentle mental landscapes, each a small, intricate puzzle that guides your thoughts without urgency or tension. You can almost feel the smoothness of marble, the gentle trickle of fountains, the soft rustling of trees and leaves, and the warmth of fading sunlight mingling with the cool evening air. Let your breathing slow further, matching the calm cadence of this imagined city. Every inhale draws in calm curiosity. Every exhale releases tension. Sleep approaches like the soft, quiet hum of a distant river, and you are carried with it effortlessly. The bizarre and the human, the strange and the familiar, all blend into a quiet, soothing rhythm. Let your mind drift gently, carrying only the soft echoes of history's creativity and human imagination. And with that, you are ready to rest. Sweet dreams.